Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen of the audience. We have been recently locked in, so I'm happy to have a captive audience. You can't walk out on me, although halfway through my lecture you may feel like doing exactly that. The full title of my presentation tonight is, you may have seen the first half, The Paradox of American Global Power, and then there is a subtitle which summarizes the paradox, the two fields of tension, dreams of democracy, and the Imperial Imperative. Now, what that is, I hope to explain to you more in depth as I keep talking. And I will keep talking for the next hour or so. So, America's power and presence in the world is still unrivaled. The connection between its power and presence is through a worldwide system of military bases, whose number is about 1,000. It is a system of high interconnectivity involving cutting-edge communications technology. Pinpoint military actions take place by remote control from halfway around the globe by people sitting at consoles at nodal points in the communication web. This configuration of power and military hardware conjures up an image of empire, of worldwide reach. As such, like any empire before it, its central concern is the control of sources of unrest and restiveness within the limits of its imperial reach. In other words, it is subject to what we might call the Imperial Imperative. Empire is as empire does. How does this square with the long-established view among Americans, as well as among those peoples at the receiving end of America's imperial sway, of America as a benevolent power, a guardian of democracy and political freedoms? What, if anything, has changed in America's international presence? Is it a matter of perception only, of people waking up to the reality of the exercise of power? Or have America's foreign policy elites fallen prey to the dictates of imperial leadership? My talk, then, addresses these big questions. Can the US be meaningfully seen as an empire in the ways it has behaved since entering the world stage as a central player after World War II? Secondly, if it is an empire, how has this affected the quality of its democratic life and institutions? One central hypothesis in my talk connects both explorations. It can be formulated as follows. If there is a logic to the life of empires that one might call the Imperial Imperative, a logic according to which the pursuit of hegemonic control to the far periphery of empire calls for ever greater concentration of power at the center, the US too will show the effects of this logic. In spite of its creed of democracy and republicanism, the US, acting as an empire, cannot escape this imperial imperative. An obvious test case is offered by the two recent presidencies of George W. Bush Jr., remember him, and of Barack Hussein Obama. Although the latter presented himself as the anti-Bush, as opposed to all transgressions of constitutional constraints that his predecessor had stood for, while promising to take America back to its first Republican principles, the Imperial Imperative, according to my hypothesis, would prevent Obama from pursuing such a course. The following then consists of two parts. A discussion of whether the US in the course of the American century can be understood as an empire is followed by a discussion of how democracy and republicanism have fared under the last two presidents. First then, America. An empire among empires? Question mark. The word empire is richly suggestive. It calls forth in our minds images of a vast geographic expanse coinciding with a reach of political and military control extending from one clear center to far-flung frontiers, usually contested. If these are the geopolitical associations we tend to connect with the word, it has different connotations as well. As any good dictionary will remind us, it is possible to hold empire, as in the expression, to hold empire over the minds of men. This then is to do with the psychological or cultural dimension of empire, where America has managed to hold empire over our collective minds. When the topic is America, and the question to be answered is whether America, or more precisely the United States, can be seen as an empire, the challenge is to place the country generically as a type, as an empire among empires, while at the same time acknowledging the specifics of the case. After all, America is a late joiner, an imperial upstart. It came to its imperial position under conditions radically different than previous empires had known. Much as it found inspiration in its early days as a republic, in the history of Rome and Athens, once it consolidated its existence as a continental state, it saw itself carried forward by the great modernizing transformations of the time, in industrial production, in communication, in technological know-how, and in political democracy. In the language of the day, Americans saw themselves engaged in the pursuit of their manifest destiny. This is mid-19th century high American rhetoric. They saw themselves engaged in the pursuit, where am I? in the pursuit of their manifest destiny, and tellingly of the westward course of empire, also words that rang through the latter half of the 19th century, the westward course of empire. It was their way, the American way at the time, of placing themselves in teleological traditions dating back to Virgil and Bishop Berkeley, yet at the same time they invented novel ways of pursuing ancient dreams. They could act in a world from the late 19th century on that went through the early stages of globalization, making for a geopolitical theater of shrinking distances and increasing connectivity and interdependence. All these trends would pick up speed during what would become known as the American century, basically the second half of the previous century. And for a reason. America, as a relatively new actor on the world stage, came to be seen as the center of modernity, a new center of gravity toward which the political compasses across the globe came to point. In the course of the 20th century, it evolved into the hub of networks in global communication, in finance, in production and innovation, in military technology, and in the techniques of mass entertainment. In the pursuit of its manifest destiny, it availed itself of all these transformations, more successfully so than any rival. Thus, as it emerged triumphantly from the Second World War, it quickly consolidated its hegemonic sway by brilliantly interweaving the various strands of imperial reach, benefiting from the many feedback loops that modernity provided. It could turn itself into the irresistible empire by mercurially morphing from one tempting model of modernity into another. Thus, as the obvious military hegemon in post-World War II days, it could use its power to give guidance to the political and economic restructuring of Europe under the Marshall Plan, facilitating trade and reconstruction through economic assistance. It also, at the same time, used its power to pry open European markets for America's mass cultural products, foremost among them Hollywood's film productions. Film, in particular, was not just a commodity subject to the logic of free trade, but also a tool of cultural diplomacy, exposing European publics to the seductive power of America's dream worlds, of fantasies of the good life as conceived by Americans. Thus, America proved expert at turning the hard power of its dominance, military and economic, into the soft power of holding empire over the minds of men, shaping their cultural appetites and dreams in ways that have led observers to speak of Americanization. Interwoven as the forms of America's dominance are, interconnected as the ways may be in which America holds empire, in the following, I propose to disentangle two dimensions. One cultural, to do with the process of Americanization. The other, to do with the hard power involved in holding empire. Both parts of my argument each revolve around a central dilemma. In the case of America's cultural empire, the dilemma is one of agency on the part of those subject to the process of Americanization. What precisely is the freedom of choice when people style their lives after American models? This particular constellation of the ways in which America holds empire points up the specifically modern, if not postmodern, form of its hegemonic power. It suggests a voluntary subordination of those under the sway of America's imperial reach that has led some observers to speak of empire by invitation or empire by adoption. Yet this is only part of the story. Repeatedly, America has had to rely on classic forms of hard power to retain imperial control, fighting wars and sending armies to the far corners of empire. These uses of hard power, I would argue, take us back to the consideration of the central dilemma explored in this essay, the dilemma that resides in the tenuous symbiosis between the hard power sustaining empire and the survival of democracy. This dilemma will engage us, the audience and the speaker, in the second part of this talk. First, let us look more closely at American empire as resting on its uses of soft power. Journalist Ron Suskind, who at the time worked for the New York Times, has this telling story about an exchange with a White House aide, possibly presidential advisor Karl Rove himself. The aide said to Ron Suskind, the aide said that guys like me, journalists like Suskind, the aide said that guys like me were in what we called a reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. And then the aide went on to say, that is not the way the world really works anymore. We are an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're the very arrogance of this, it's incredible. We're history's actors. And you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. This is a far cry indeed from a Jeffersonian empire of liberty, let alone an empire of reason. What Susskind was offered was a view of a postmodern deconstructionist world where the reality principle no longer sets any meaningful constraints. A view not of an empire of reason, but of a realm where human volition, the human will, like Schopenhauer's will to power, was in command. We are an empire now. The same statement, I repeat it for you to give it the proper resonance in your heads. We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. This voluntarist, if not cavalier attitude towards truth and reality may remind us of the famous line by the newspaper man in John Ford's, the famous Hollywood director of the newspaper man in John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. You may remember the film, if not the line, and I quote the line, "This is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, we print the legend." Such a telling little phrase. The words quoted by Susskind may strike us like the musings of a delusional mind, more likely to be encountered behind the walls of an asylum than inside the White House. They evoke an Alice in Wonderland world where you can put a president dressed in bomber jacket on an aircraft carrier under the banner declaring mission accomplished and present this as a reality newly created. They are words conveying a megalomania that in the 1960s, Senator Fulbright had already diagnosed as the arrogance of power, a famous collection of essays and speeches from the 1966-67, Senator Fulbright. But at the same time, the quotation of "we are an empire now," but at the same time they are shrewd words, words of wisdom even. They point to what has driven imperial projects throughout history in a quest for domain and dominance. Time and time again, new realities have been created and space been opened up for hegemony to be established and an imperial writ to run. This applies to Rome as much as it does to Britain in the 19th century and the United States, let's say until quite recently, if not today. Not every attempt along such lines need end in parody, like mission accomplished, Bush in the bomber jacket. Not every attempt needs end in parody in an object lesson in human hubris. As a long line of studies of empire have shown, there is an arch to the history of empires, a rise followed by decline. But their natural histories, their life cycles, constitute a substantive body of historical reality, more than being the elusive chimeras conjured before our eyes by the illusionism of our postmodern culture of mediated spectacle. There are substantive realities calling for scholarly attention, although they may be hidden from view by their rendition as media spectacle. We may see this illustrated in the shock and awe media version of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Shock and awe were the words used then. We will show those guys in Iraq, shock and awe. We'll bomb them and they won't know what's happening. The shock and awe media version of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or of the television rendition of the first Gulf War as a high-tech spectacle, almost a television game. In response, French semiotician Jean Baudrillard felt induced to write on the alienating experience of watching history unfold on the TV screen. He ironically titled his little book, "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place." And it's still worth reading. It's a beautiful critique of the illusionism of what the media tell us and show us. When Baudrillard chooses to focus on the illusionism and media manipulation attending the display of imperial power, when he highlights the reduction of a real war, let's not forget there was a real war being fought, waged, the reduction of a real war being waged to the entertainment value of a video war game, he reminds us of the reality principle in history and of its real cost in human lives and human suffering. Yet at the same time, he reminds us of what we might call the principle of virtual reality in our postmodern world, where mass audiences live by the very fictions conjured before their eyes. Virtual worlds, and virtual realities are the permanent setting of many people's contemporary lives. An astute observer of this happening is German filmmaker Wim Wenders, fascinated from an early age on by America and American culture, yet increasingly aware of the Americanization of the culture of his German homeland. He has one character in one of his films from the mid-1970s come up with this aphorism: "The Yanks have colonized our subconscious." Think of that, have colonized our subconscious. And there is nothing you can do because it's your subconscious. It came in through the back door when you sat there enjoying American films. This one line beautifully captures a central dimension of the sway that America holds over people's imaginations, inside and beyond its national borders. It is the power of what is commonly referred to as America's cultural imperialism, a word that has been circulating since the 1960s onwards in discussions of the power of the media and the radiance of American mass culture. Yet a power that gainsays anything the word imperialism suggests. American cultural conquest works through the subconscious of its subjects, colonizing it almost by stealth, shaping people's cultural appetites, tastes, yearnings and needs in an American vein, simply by exposing them to its radiance and appeal. Of course, all empires have used entertainment to keep the populace contented, famously through bread and circuses, as the Romans had it. But they were like nothing compared to present-day mass media of communication and entertainment. Mass culture has undergone a modernizing transformation in all its stages, from production through its dissemination and advertising to its eventual consumption by us collectively. And American mass culture, from its early formation in the late 19th century to the present day, has always managed to corner the world market and expose a world audience to its impact. Studying this impact Scholars of Americanization, and I count myself among them, scholars of Americanization have pointed to the pleasure principle in the reception of American mass culture. In its many forms, American mass culture offered a free range for the imagination to roam, allowing people to consider alternative lifestyles and identities. Remember the Marlboro Man? Allowing people to consider alternative lifestyles and identities, suggesting a freedom to be your own agent in projecting your own life. Yet, as critics of mass culture have pointed out all along, there was always the threat of enslavement, of mass culture offering nothing more than an opiate for the people, as Marx would have it. This line of critique has evolved from being a cheap form of vulgar Marxism into a rather subtle form of deconstructionism, in tune with the linguistic turn taken by the new American studies. This recent trend has led many Americanists to revisit the very language they use and critically to examine the tacit assumptions underlying the concepts central to their understanding of America. As recent presidential addresses to the American Studies Association illustrate, this self-examination can go as far as to lead to a call for deleting the word America from American studies as a concept inherently indoctrinating and imperialist. Key words in traditional American studies are now seen as tools of indoctrination by stealth, inducing a worldview subject to American agency and American control. This is probably what Wim Wenders had in mind when he spoke of America colonizing the European subconscious. What the new American studies approach pursues is to uncover the way this process works and to point to language as the Trojan horse, smuggling in covert readings and meanings, presenting them as conventional and natural, while subtly bending and subverting people's views of the world. A good case in point is one presidential address to the American Studies Association in the US. And it's interesting to realize that this is Americans doing this to themselves, undermining their own collective beliefs, deconstructing their accepted views of themselves. It's amazing that this is happening in American universities, much to the chagrin, let me remind you, of Fox News media. They see universities as centers of anti-Americanism, which is probably correct. A good case in point is another presidential address, Amy Kaplan's 2003 discussion of violent belongings and the question of empire. She notes that the word empire has entered general discussion in the US on a scale not seen before. Instead of being an empire in denial, or an empire that does not dare speak its name, it is fashionable now, Kaplan says, to debate whether this is a new imperialism or business as usual. Whether the United States should be properly called imperial or hegemonic, whether it is benevolent or self-interested, whether it should rely on hard power or soft power, whether this empire most closely resembles the British Empire or the Roman, and whether it is in ascendancy or decline. She goes on to make this important point, and I quote her, "I am not interested in joining these debates here, but in discussing the language that frames them, and how the word empire appears in a constellation of other words in the political lexicon, such as terrorism and homeland. The denial and disavowal of empire," she goes on to argue, "has long served as the ideological cornerstone of US imperialism and a key component of American exceptionalism. America is not like other empires. America is not like other nations or states. It is sui generis." She describes her own approach as a method of exposure, one that reveals the repressed violence embedded in cultural productions, and she looks at film, she looks at novels, cultural productions more generally. And these words that I just quoted precisely describe the program for A New American Studies as it has evolved in recent years. A program that aims at unveiling the techniques that mass cultural productions avail themselves of in communicating imperial readings of the world, seen from an American vantage point. Much work in this vein, by Kaplan herself and many others, has looked at the ways in which early forms of American mass culture, like the Yellow Press, World's Fairs, Wild West shows, Buffalo Bill writing, early film rushes of the storming of San Juan Hill, and mostly studio reenactments, by the way, how all these forms of early mass entertainment, how they entertained the masses, while at the same time communicating the exhilaration of imperial ventures and the psychological satisfactions of forming the top tier of hierarchies of race and civilization. The white man on top, and America on top of a hierarchy of Western civilization. Many of these readings were subliminal and unreflected, insinuating themselves into the normal ways of conceiving of the world. Yet at the same time, many of these readings were a conscious part of the cultural productions of the late 19th century, put there by cultural entrepreneurs who, as a group, represented the cultural elite of the time. They were engaged in establishing and sustaining the forms of cultural hegemony and cultural capital that Antonio Gramsci, you may have heard of him, and later on Pierre Bourdieu have theorized. Earlier historical research has looked at the elite levels in society, at the circles in politics, journalism, and intellectual life that gave articulate support to America's imperialist stance. I'll skip a part here. So this is then for the exploration of America's inbred imperialist instincts and of the way that these instincts and intimations of empire and the joys of empire, of holding empire, how they were woven into the production, the mass cultural production of public entertainment, and the way it then educated large masses of people in America first and later on elsewhere in the world, how it educated those people in that particular American worldview. On December the 6th, 2011, President Obama delivered a speech, one of the many he has delivered and which have established his sort of reputation as one of the great men, and that is an indestructible position he established for himself, as one of the great men in using language as a tool to address a mass audience in a democracy, explain the facts of life to them, the trends of history to them. And this is what established him as a remarkable man early on, even as a presidential candidate in 2008. In 1910, he reminded his audience, Teddy Roosevelt came here to Osawatomie, and he laid out his vision for what he called a new nationalism. Our country, he said, means nothing unless it means the triumph of a real democracy, of an economic system under which each man shall be guaranteed the opportunity to show the best that there is in him. Roosevelt's words. Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin. Like Roosevelt before him, Obama had come wielding a big stick, holding forth against political gridlock in Washington politics. And he had been suffering from political gridlock with the sort of partisan dividing line, two blocks, party blocks, opposed to each other, and the one sort of holding the other in a stranglehold. and preventing any meaningful political discussion and political decision-making in Congress. So he was holding forth there in this speech against political gridlock in Washington politics and the ideological stranglehold of the you're-on-your-own economics of Republicans. Quite a remarkable speech, actually. The raging debate, and these are Obama's words, the raging debate over the best way to restore growth and prosperity, restore balance, restore fairness, Obama argued, is the defining issue of our time. Obama pointed to the growing inequality and income disparity in American society. Inequality, and I quote him again, inequality also distorts our democracy. It gives an outsized voice to the few who can afford high-priced lobbyists and unlimited campaign contributions, and it runs the risk of selling out our democracy to the highest bidder. This is Obama speaking, 2011. It leaves everyone else rightly suspicious that the system in Washington is rigged against them, that our elected representatives aren't looking out for the interests of most Americans. Like Roosevelt before him, Obama spoke on behalf of a more inclusive view of democracy and the national interest. And I don't recall him using similar language in any of the 3 presidential campaign electoral debates on television. Far removed from this sort of incisive critique in a public speech. This is Obama at his best. On another Rooseveltian theme, though, the theme of empire and the way it affects democracy, Obama was strangely silent. And not only in Osawatomie. It is a theme that had divided Rooseveltian progressives against themselves, with minority voices like Jane Addams warning of imperialism's baneful impact on democracy at home. It is a theme that on similar grounds Obama might have seen as equally a defining issue of our time. At the top of his rhetorical mastery, in speeches concerning racism, for instance, as a divisive force in American society, or the use of military power in foreign policy, as he did in his speech in Oslo accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, Obama finds his place in America's great tradition of the statesman as public orator and master of rhetoric. In that role, he explains, renders account, and invites the public to reflect. Obama is keenly aware of this long line of history, using it to place himself squarely in an American political tradition. Repeatedly, he takes his cue from inspiring predecessors. Taking this inspirational role, Obama not only addresses his fellow Americans, inciting them to political participation, he also speaks to the world, rekindling an enthusiasm for American leadership after the damage done to it during 8 long years of the Bush presidency. When still a candidate vying for the presidency, Obama gave a speech in Berlin, and you can still look it up on YouTube, or you may even remember having seen it. He gave a speech in Berlin on July 24th, 2008, before a crowd of thousands whose lost hopes for America Obama seemed to restore and personify. In fine rhetorical balance, he brought together a reference to the Berlin Wall with Lincoln's metaphor of the house divided, famous speech by Lincoln. You can look that up too on YouTube, although it's not Lincoln himself. You will see there. In fine rhetorical balance, he brought together a reference to the Berlin Wall with Lincoln's metaphor of the house divided. It put the audience in mind of Kennedy's famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, delivered during his visit to Berlin in the days of the Cold War. Obama wanted to present himself as the embodiment of an America with which Europeans could once again feel affiliated. And I quote from that speech, "The walls between old allies on either side of the Atlantic cannot stand. Thus, in a city not long before divided by a wall, divided against itself, Lincoln's words assumed a poignant resonance and called forth an association with Lincoln's half-slave, half-free." I may remind you of what Lincoln argued, that he said, a republic cannot survive half-slave and half-free. We have to choose, make up our mind on moral grounds. When words like these come from the mouths of Americans, the danger is always of an implied missionary zeal, of interventionist intentions even, particularly today after the cynical misuse of similar language to justify military adventurism by the Bush administration. Obama is too much like Lincoln in his awareness of the tragic dimension, the tragic tension between politics and ethics, between idealism and realism. When confronting such hard choices, he is rather a man of steel, not the weed that waves with the tides. He does not hesitate to speak his mind on matters of great concern to him, whether it is bankers and their obscene remunerations, and these were his words, he used the word obscene to describe this situation, or the failing security apparatus in America. When acceding to the presidency in early 2009, Barack Obama appeared as the anti-Bush that many during the campaign had come to see in him. When he took the oath of office, swearing to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States, it seemed like the first step in rolling back the relentless encroachment upon the restraints of executive power set by the Constitution and by international law as endorsed and signed by the United States. Obama had all the right credentials for this role. As a senator, he had voted against the war in Iraq as an illegal war of aggression. As a candidate, he promised to close Guantanamo Bay's detention center, which in the eyes of the world had come to symbolize the illegitimacy of the ways in which America, under President Bush, had chosen to wage its global war on terrorism. Obama appeared like the man who would bring to light the dark and secret world beyond the reach of law and legal protections that America had ventured upon. A world of illegal surveillance of its own citizenry, a world of secret renditions of terrorist suspects, of torture and high-tech retaliatory assassination. He appeared to bring a promise of ending all this and to return to a presidency under the law rather than above it. In words from his inaugural address, "My administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government." If hopes were pinned so high on the Obama presidency, how would this square with the trends in American presidential leadership that come under such names as the unitary executive or the Imperial Presidency? This was a book title going back to the late 1960s, a book written by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who at the time sort of engaged the debate with this trend of an increasing imperial presidency, of increasing concentration of power in the hands of the executive, bypassing Congress, bypassing other controlling agencies within the United States institutional setup. The trend was seen by many observers in the United States and Europe as a continued erosion of America's democratic and constitutional order, a continued power grab by the American president, who as chief executive in charge of the national interest felt unduly hampered by established constitutional constraints, such as the institutional checks and balances or the constitutional protection of civil rights and civil liberties. Ever more intrusive in the fabric of social relations, in the name of anti-terrorist surveillance, ever more scornful of institutional countervailing powers, the Bush presidency subverted the American Constitution, although it was held by oath to protect it. This can be seen as only the latest, most daring version of what Arthur Schlesinger, in his 1968 book, The Imperial Presidency, had warned Americans against. In fact, this suspicion of slow democratic erosion goes back farther, and I give a few illustrations of that longer history of critical minds in the United States seeing the danger and threat of power being concentrated in the hands of the executive, the president. Many of the worries and concerns in Europe about this imperial drift in American politics fed directly into Europe's feelings of anti-Americanism. Hopes were that Obama, taking his oratorical cues from Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, might indeed take America back to its first high principles, which, as Machiavelli reminds us, is the central recipe for preserving a republic. You have to go back time and time again to first founding principles, rather than subvert them and erode them slowly. This would require a more direct and intellectually articulate communication with his American and world audience. Yet, given the pressure on him to exert his leadership as a president who called the war in Afghanistan a war of necessity, temptations must be great to cut constitutional corners in the manner of his predecessor. Obama may find it hard to give up gains in executive power as they have accrued to the presidency over the last several years. Yet, in a democratic spirit, upholding the Constitution, while scaling back some of the legal enormities of the Bush administration, he must be held to develop ways of forceful leadership that Americans and non-Americans alike will see as convincing and legitimate. At present, though, and I'm getting to the end of my what is increasingly sounding like an indictment. At present, though, things do not bode well. In fact, early signs seem to point rather in the direction of continuity with Bush administration practices. Thus, in the crucial civil rights area of the treatment of detainees held in the context of the war on terror, the Obama administration took steps and invented arguments to maintain the power to imprison terrorism suspects for extended periods without judicial oversight. The man who, as presidential candidate, had still spoken of the false choice between fighting terrorism and respecting habeas corpus, and had rejected the Bush administration's attempt at creating a black hole at Guantanamo, now did exactly that by moving detainees not to Guantanamo anymore, but farther away to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, beyond the reach of constitutional protections. In the same vein, the man who was presidential candidate reminded his audience that as a former constitutional law professor, he would, unlike the current president, George Bush, he would actually respect the Constitution That man acted in contravention of the 1973 War Powers Resolution adopted by Congress when he authorized US military intervention in Libya. In the tortured language of Orwellian newspeak, Obama denied that the Libyan intervention was a war at all. So War Powers Acts do not apply if it's not a war. So this is a sort of game played with definitions and what words mean. Ironically, Obama thus cast aside a congressional resolution adopted in 1973, whose intention it had been to restore the balance between the powers of Congress and the presidency after years of the balance tilting towards the executive in the years of the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration. As a further point, rather than the government itself living up to its promise of unprecedented openness, we see a resurgence of leakers of secret government policies, of whistleblowers, reminiscent of the days of the leaked Pentagon Papers, 1968, Daniel Ellsberg, one of my cultural heroes, I must admit, who recently gave advice to the American population on how to vote. He said, go out and vote, make sure to go out and vote for Obama, although I have great criticisms of Obama, but think of the alternative. The culmination point so far is the flood of WikiLeaks foreign policy documents. The Obama administration's response was vindictive, not in the sense of unknown openness. Let it all go out, let the public be informed. No, this response was vindictive and very much in the manner of an insulted sovereign. In the manner of a unitary executive without due process, it held an alleged leaker of documents, Bradley Manning, in solitary confinement. And, well, there's more on this sorry story, which keeps developing. There is increasingly now, that's not in this text yet, but it will be soon, there is increasingly this attempt still pursuing a war on terror of a campaign to weed out potential terrorists. There is now in the United States a massive store of documents, not just on potential terrorists in the Middle East, but on every individual American, which is then, with modern techniques of, what's it called? Mass reading of massive amounts of data. Data mining is the word I'm looking for, data mining. Used to construct points where suspicious areas exist. And the word for that now is, it's a euphemism, although it sounds very ominous. It is disposition matrix. So in this matrix, people will be selected, set aside, set apart as potential objects of disposition, to get disposed of them. American citizens included. And this came out in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, in a well-researched, impressive article. The New York Times occasionally is very good. When it's good, it's very good. So this goes on, this creation of a shadowy world that is not in the news, with exceptions, that is not on television, that is not in presidential debates, that most Americans are totally unaware of. They don't know who they vote for, why they vote. This is all hidden from their view. Well, anyway, like the phrase unitary executive, this concentration of power in the hands of the president himself or herself soon, the words executive privilege are suggestive of constitutional law doctrines justifying the leeway presidents grant themselves in their unilateral choice of means in defense of the national interest. That is always their excuse. They do this to protect the national interest, to protect the nation and its national security. So the whole background to all these trends is the creation of a constant state of war and a constant state of emergency. And a war on terror, by definition, it never ends. As they kill suspects of terror, they create new suspects of terror, people angry at what happened the day before in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, Yemen, what have you. Let me see. I'm running ahead of myself. Oh yes, here we are. So Obama is now getting praise from Fox News for what he does. Strong man, not soft on terrorism, but fighting the right war, judged by the company Obama attracts. We would be hard put to recognize in him what so many during the campaign had hopefully anticipated. As president, he found himself in a role as commander-in-chief, fighting two ground wars and a more general one against the elusive enemy of global terrorism without a clear exit strategy. They are wars he took over when entering office, and which he has pursued by means that make it hard to see a personal touch to distinguish him from his predecessor, let alone to recognize the signs of a transformational presidency. Yet those were the words that Colin Powell, a black Republican, former defense secretary, a black Republican, used in his quiet and eloquent television endorsement of Obama during the electoral campaign in 2008. There is irony today in referring back to this moment. Here we had a man who had given his name, Colin Powell, who had given his name to a military doctrine, the Powell Doctrine, reminding military planners never to enter a war without a clear exit strategy. A full 2 years later, President Obama is mired in wars without exit strategies, expanding programs of secret action in the Middle East, without any prospect of the endeavor holding the promise of a new beginning, a new start. But more than that, Obama seems mired in the insider ways of Washington, while losing the rapport he had with the broad constituency that carried him to the presidency. If his march to the White House testified to the power of rhetoric, Obama has found no way yet, it seems, to use the presidency as a bully pulpit to engage and educate his public in the moral dilemmas of the exercise of power. In other words, he has not yet developed a rhetoric of power. He doesn't talk publicly about policies he has designed that he is pursuing, like drone wars with kill lists and what have you. He's not publicly discussing those, trying to give a good account of both the ethical implications of this and what it does as a tool of foreign policy to America's standing in the world. I think I will leave it at that.
Alrighty, I think it's time to open the floor from questions of the audience. I'd like you to raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about the influence of Hollywood on the opinions of people in the rest of the world. But when people talk of Hollywood and the American dream, you sometimes get the idea that this was all part of a bigger plan. But the Hollywood movies made were, I guess, made by scriptwriters and directors. Is there any indication that politics itself is involved in shaping those opinions of the American way and the way people should live other than the propaganda videos made for the different wars in the beginning of the TV era?
Yeah. There is very little indication that Hollywood follows a script that is conspiratorial. They produce films, and they're in it for the money. They lose a lot of money, they win a few big blockbusters and what have you. They're in it for the money. Yet, as those new trends in American studies are now exploring, it may well be that there is an underlying story that ties all these fantasies of freedom, of the Marlborough man taking his horse to water with the sun setting, inspiring dreams and fantasies of, oh, I want to be like him. I want to wear his clothes. I want to smoke his cigarettes, is of course what the point of that particular advertisement was. So America has developed an amazing mastery in weaving fantasies together that all have to do with fantasies of freedom, fantasies of private identity, of being your own free agent as a woman or as a man, or as something in between. There were some iconic heroes in American pop culture that produced figures that are strangely by gender, so to speak. But it's all that. But it's always done, in the case of advertising, it's always done to sell a product, clothes, cigarettes, soft drinks, you name it. But they're always tied to tempting, seducing fantasies, which at the subconscious level then makes you buy that brand of cigarette rather than another brand of cigarette, or that soft drink rather than another soft drink. At the same time, it's like a slow drip, sort of exposure to worlds made in America. These are American dreams that we then begin to share. This is Wim Wenders. They colonized our subconscious, those damn Yankees. And yet, at the same time, he loves it. He wants to make films in that same vein, exploring in Paris, Texas, a great movie that he made, sort of going there, tempted by the fascination that America has had for him. And many Hollywood movies do this, they play on those fantasies, yet there is a whole range of movies that explore the dark sides of American, like the gangland movies, the 1930s, black and white, appropriately, gangster stories told, nothing to do with the purity of life, the ethical nobility of American life, Republican principles. There was nothing Republican about the principles that drove people, the leading characters in American gangland movies. But they were all private productions. This is America and its concept of how you make products, how you sell them, how you advertise them, the free market. This is neoliberalism before the word was in use. This is typically America, the free market. And there are only few cases that illustrate a government attempt to use Hollywood's mastery at telling film stories to indoctrinate the public for political positions. The one example I can think of now is Green Berets, a film financed by the Pentagon to try and make the American public see the government point in pursuing the war in Vietnam. Have you seen that movie ever? It's quite interesting, but that's one example of a movie produced under government auspices to make a government policy point.
Sorry, but if nobody can recall the film, then can it really be considered a success?
Well, this is much later, and I occasionally talk to other audiences who do remember the movie. But no, this is trying to pull your leg, and I can't even reach it from here.
What's the name?
Green Berets, with John Wayne in it.
It's not only the Green Berets where the Pentagon has been involved with Hollywood films. It's American war movies. When the Americans are winning, are the heroes, then it's very approved by the Pentagon, and they support these Hollywood films.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a further role to the American government, particularly in the immediate post-war years where films were sort of vetted. Can we send this abroad? Does this show in America that we want to be shown? But normally that's not the case. Films are being sent abroad, and if they are duds, they won't work. People won't go there to see them. But normally it's a matter of people voting with their feet, illustrating the power of Hollywood films in competition with films produced elsewhere. There's that famous story of Jurassic Park, a Spielberg movie. Do you remember that one? Okay. Jurassic Park. It was about to be released in France. And then the French government decided to try and keep it out of the country because, as the then Minister of Culture in France, in Paris, said, Jacques Lang was his name, he said, this is an affront to the French cultural identity. We cannot expose our national public to this. The real story behind that was that France had produced its own mega blockbuster movie based on a novel by Balzac, Germinal, and it was about to be released. And the fear in French government circles was that people would vote with their feet, go see Jurassic Park, and forget about Germinal. And that's actually the way it turned out.
Yes, there's another question in the back there, and then here in the front.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the very eloquent and description of one approach. My question, I would like to go into the metaphor of the... maybe you should talk a bit louder? Or
No.
Oh, okay. Into the metaphor of the colonization of our subconscious by the Yanks. And I was just wondering if you could react to the following, what I was thinking about it. Could you still see it as a colonization when we gladly accept it and we embrace it in a way? And wouldn't it also be a way to depict it as a seed planted? Because a colonization, a colonizator, that in itself would include a check, someone who tries to steer it, someone who is controlling the movement. While I'm not sure if that is happening right now. Of course, in a way, they're trying to influence and trying to make sure everything goes the way the American government wants it to go. But on the other hand, you could also see it as a broader, universal human wanting for development. And at this time, it's America who's providing us for the development. So it's not necessarily led by the American, but more it's from above, led by a human longing for development, and the latest and newest and the best.
I have my own microphone. I forgot about it. No, you're absolutely right. In itself, there's nothing wrong with America planting seeds of dreams of freedom and individualism in our heads. There's something wrong with that if it leads necessarily, if it sort of triggers responses like Pavlovian dogs that then, oh, I must smoke that particular cigarette. That is, of course, the point of advertising. That is the threat of much of Americanization. That is why the word was introduced. That America drips these tempting elixirs in our ears. And in itself, there's nothing wrong with the force of temptation, with the voice of seduction. But if it then leads, and that's the subconscious part of it, if it then leads, without your being aware of this, to further behavior, to triggered behavior, then you need to act. Then you need to speak up. And that is why Europeans came up with that word Americanization. And it was actually, it's a French coinage, the word Americanisation, mid-19th century. It was Baudelaire, the poet, who first came up with this and pointed to the dangers of all these tempting, and he said it on the occasion of America coming to World's Fairs in Paris and showing their amazing modernity in so many areas. They won all the prizes in photography, in construction, in what have you, in harvesters to bring in the harvest in the fall. Tempting. There was this rival to French pride, to British pride, to European pride. There was this rival emerging. And a rival that sort of crept in by the back door. That is what so many students of cultural imperialism point to. It sort of seeps in unnoticed. Yet at the same time, once you point to the danger, you can make it a national debate. And the French are very good in having every other week national debates on the problems with American culture. They're very good at that. They're very aware of what American culture can do to France. At the same time, they love American culture. There is that interesting story of that group of young cinematographers, movie makers, filmmakers in France, the Nouvelle Vague, the New Wave in the early 60s. They were all, before they started to make their own movies, they were all film critics. And they had sat for many hours, half their lives, in the dark of movie theaters, watching American B movies and adoring them. And then something typically French happened, typical for the history of the French reception of American mass culture. They noticed that they loved those movies, and then they went one step further than American film critics did, or American audiences did. They started to account for their fascination on paper, in classic film reviews, film essays, published in the Cahiers du Cinéma. And it's still amazing to look it up and see that moment when a French young generation gets fascinated by American mass culture, film in this case, sits down and tries intellectually to account for it. Much the same had happened in the 1930s with American jazz music, which in the United States, you drank your beer, you smoked your cigarette, you danced to the music, and you liked it or you didn't. And it was mostly for young kids, not for the older generation. When jazz came to France, the same happened. French intellectuals sat down and developed a canon of what was good jazz and what was bad jazz, and why. A critical discourse, a language. They developed there, and same happened in Germany. Some of the great early thinkers about jazz music are European. And then, of course, another thing happened where European composers, in the grand manner, the Beethovens of the 20th century, Ravel and others, Debussy, had picked up sounds from America and thought, we can use this. And they wove it into their quest for a new musical idiom. And their classic pieces, a piano, a quartet, string quartet by Ravel, where the last part is called blues. He probably pronounced it with a French accent, blues. But still, there you have it. There's so many ways of reception. And that is what always fascinated me in my work, trying to explore the ways and byways that American culture reached the outside world, and what then happened at the hands of the audience, at the point of reception. But of course, the central assignment, and you sort of point to that, the central assignment would always be to be aware of what you're exposed to take away the subconscious part that Wim Wenders was so painfully aware of at one point. And after all, it's the voice of one of his creations, one of his actors in a film that he made. But still, he tries to make a point there. And the point that we all should share is, let's be aware of the joys and dangers of American culture. Not only when it comes to entertainment, but also when it comes to politics. So much is being said in highfalutin language. Freedom is on the march. George Bush kept saying, when what was on the march was American military boots in Afghanistan and Iraq. And particularly the Iraq War was, and will go down in history as a disaster, upsetting an apple cart in the Middle East, creating more problems than it ever solved, if any.
Let's have another question.
Yeah.
There was one in the front over there, and the lady over here is next.
You talk now again about Americanization, and before you talked about America as an empire. Now, what I see in my generation right now is that we are very America critically. So we see, when I talk about with my friend who's studying American studies right now, talking about how the system is messed up, like with what you also said, with the two-block system. And is this now maybe going into a direction of an anti-Americanization, that maybe the future of generations of Europe maybe so critically of America that they try to ignore the...
But there's a long history, if there is a history of the Americanization of Europe, and the Americanization always worked through the younger generations. They were the most open to welcoming it and making it part of their cultural repertoire. But there is an equally long history of anti-Americanism, of people warning, or even of young people. Normally it's the older people who warn and the younger people who say, this is nice, this is fun, this is cool. But there is a cross-generational element to both trends, to the Americanization and the critique, the resistance.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, and then the lady in the front over here. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, she's been waiting for quite some time, so you better hurry up with your question.
How do you think Obama's foreign policy would look like if he does get reelected? Just in regards to Israel or Iran or Syria or the Middle East.
Let me follow up to that question, and maybe you can pass the microphone to this lady already. What will his foreign policy look like? That's a pretty tough question, to say the least. Let me relate that to your lecture a bit. You gave us an analysis, or maybe I should rather say deconstruction of American power. And it was quite academic, to say the least. We heard Bourdieu, we heard Baudrillard. So let me get that back to the ground a bit.
Terrible.
That's the French soft power in academia, right, that we see here at work. You refer to a degree of continuity between the Obama administration and the Bush administration. And what if we look at the Romney-Obama ticket? Would you say that, they kind of go together on this? We will see a continuation of what we've seen so far. In other words, the American foreign policy, whether it's Obama or Romney, will not change a lot because there's this level of continuity?
Fortunately, for one thing, they're not on the same ticket.
I agree, but
you said Obama
The Obama-Romney ticket, in the sense that nothing's going to change. They do it together.
No, this is neither here nor there. I think if you look back at or go back in your mind to the last discussion, there was amazing agreement between them. Romney really didn't have an angle that drastically differed or could push Obama in directions that he didn't want to go. My problem is that Obama has gone so much in the direction already of what was an established foreign policy view, much more naked imperialism under Bush than it had been before. In terms of words used, we are an empire now. That would have been impossible to say as words before. But in terms, if you actually look at the way that power is exercised and the way that power works, my point is that you can't do all that much. Whatever your promises, whatever your rhetorical construction of an alternative, go back to idealism, go back to roots, republicanism. Once you're in it, you're sucked into a vortex. And I used the words, the Imperial Imperative. There is an imperative. You have to do certain things. For two reasons. You have to do them for foreign policy reasons, in response to what happens there, and you have to do it with an eye on internal political balance. If Obama had not done what he had done, he would have gone down as being soft on terrorism, the way that a constant fear of Democrats in the 1950s, late 40s, 50s, 60s was to be seen as soft on communism. So Democrats felt urged, and that is the imperative, they felt urged to be holier than thou, to be not softer but harder on communism, harder on terrorism than Republicans. And that is a sort of inbuilt logic that it is so hard to escape from. Now you.
Yeah, now me. But the question is already answered, I think so. I wanted to go more into this topic, how can we understand this Obama switch? But it was actually what you were answering this question of him or him.
Yeah.
But it was a question for me for longer.
Yeah. You had been waiting so patiently for so long to raise the issue.
But then your question is...
But anyway, the important thing is that the issue came up.
Okay, let's have two more questions and then we'll call it a day. First are in the front and the second is you.
Hello. Am I well heard? Well, I will continue the topic of the foreign policy and stuff. The lecture is called The Paradox of Global American Power, American Global Power, and you were talking about the position of America as a democracy and the fact that in foreign policy it sometimes does not really act in a very democratic way towards the other countries. And as far as I understand, you imply that this is a paradox, or not? But then I don't think I really agree with you in that, because after all, the politicians in America, just like in any other country, they are responsible to their own people. And you can argue about
old people?
To the people of the country.
Okay, yeah.
And whatever you can say about the flows of democratic processes in America, that's still that's still a comparatively democratic country. And so you will have to, if there are people who want America to act like that, the politicians have to satisfy the
what is your
wishes
question, if I may?
Of the people who vote for them. So you cannot expect any turns of 180 degrees. I mean, all the turns of 180 degrees in any policy won't last till the next midterms. I think that's quite expectable. And I cannot think of any other way of doing things, so it doesn't seem paradoxical to me.
Well, the paradox as I see it is that America has used for a long time, still uses that argument that they're doing this to bring freedom and democracy. That is the argument they use. Now, if you're Putin in Russia, you don't have to use that argument. It won't sell in Russia as a foreign policy explanation. It won't sell in many other countries, I'm pretty sure. America prides itself on its exceptionalism. Now, that whole idea that it is an exceptional nation can be deconstructed, but that's another lecture. I won't do that tonight. Don't fear. Have no fear.
Well, the point is that I don't think that's the worst option. I mean...
No, but the paradox then is that they use this argument and they actually see it happening. They're amazing in the way they can see what they think is taking place. Democracy is on the march, George Bush said. Ignoring the mess in Iraq and other places, democracy is on the march.
Yes, because he is not because the people in Iraq don't vote for Bush and don't vote for Obama just because they can't.
I'm going to stop you here. You can continue the discussion after the lecture. Let's have the final question.
Thank you. What do you think is the importance for the American empire of the military bases in allied countries? If they spread their influence through culture, why do they have all these bases? Are they like a security mechanism? And what do they do there all day? Because
would I knew that? But the way you put it rephrases what I was talking about. Soft power, cultural imperialism, holding sway, holding empire over the minds of people, versus, if that doesn't work sufficiently for you, make sure to have bases.
Yeah, but so they're there as an actual threat to the countries they're in, or how do you have to see that?
Most of these bases are there with the consent not of the governed necessarily, but of the governments. Even in Central Asia, America has bases. And they negotiate it, they probably pay a lot of money. There are so many ways to keep the locals contented.
But these bases are also in Germany, right? Am I mistaken?
Yeah, not as many as there used to be, but the total number of American military personnel in Germany at the time is 54,000, down from close to 500,000 at the height of the Cold War, but still a sizable number. And it's not to protect Germany from anything. It works as one of the hubs in what Americans think of. Americans, more than any European country or more than any other country in the world, I think, they take this global view of their empire. And they make sure they can commune with satellites up there, local stations, posts, all over the Pacific Ocean. Small islands, uninhabited islands, but there are masts there, signals, receivers and transmitters and what have you, plus a few personnel, of course, to surface all this. And it's a global network. It's continually interconnected. There is a connectivity to this. And not too many Americans are aware of this. And the amazing thing is, if you call the Pentagon, and many military analysts and military historians have tried to find out precisely, calling the Pentagon, how many bases are there? Well, you never get the right answer since they don't actually know. How do you count? What counts as a basis? Is it the small one that recently went up last week as a drone guiding site? How do you count? But anyway, about 1,000 bases all over the world. This is like the Roman Empire updated.
The Roman Empire. That's a nice ending, I think. I have a last question for the audience, and then I'll let you go home. So, if you were an American citizen, what would you vote? I think that's a nice end to this series of lectures. Please stand up if you would vote for Mitt Romney. Please stand up if you would vote for Obama. Well now, okay. Please sit down for just for 30 more seconds. The name of these series was One Nation Under God, and we came to an end with these series with addressing some European views of the US too. So I think that the gift for Professor Rob Kroes has a wonderful title. May we be forgiven for our strong viewpoints here, and for whatever comes next with Romney or Obama. Thank you.
Thanks.